Chapter 9. Jaime rises from the dead. Jack couldn't remember what he'd been dreaming about, but suddenly whatever it was turned into a memory from last Easter. Pitch in his nightmares taking the tooth fairies. The screams were so clear in Jack's head, it was almost like hearing it all over again. And then he realized he was hearing it all over again. He woke with a yelp because someone was pulling his hair. He looked around bewilderedly, and then he spotted Babytooth flittering in front of his face. She was chirping a mile a minute, way too fast for Jack to understand anything. But one thing was for sure. Something was horribly wrong. Immediately, Jack's eyes snapped to Jaime, but Jaime wasn't there. He didn't remember getting to his feet, but in the next moment, he'd grabbed his staff and plowed through the door. He almost jumped straight off the balcony, but caught himself at the last moment when Babytooth screeched at him to stop. He cursed and jumped down the stairs instead. "What happened?" he yelled at Babytooth as he sprinted down the mountain, trying not to slip on the dewy grass. Babytooth tried to answer, but she was too panicked to make any sense to Jack. She kept flying ahead, yelling at him to follow and hurry up. Jack cursed the moon, the time fragment, and even himself, whoever was at fault for making him lose his powers. He was too slow. He slipped several times on the way down, scratching up his knees and bare feet, but he ignored the pain and was quick back up and running. Soon he was sprinting through the quiet, dimly lit village. Babytooth was still chirping loudly at him, fast and incomprehensible. "You have to speak slower, Babytooth. I'm not fluent in..." Out of nowhere, a person came running from around the corner of a hut, and Jack didn't have the time to dodge. He collided straight into the person, hard enough to send them both to the ground. Jack lost his grip on the staff to catch himself with his hands. Pain shot up his left arm. "What the..." The other person started indignantly. It was a girl's voice, and it took a few seconds before Jack realized who it belonged to. He rolled away, scrambling for his staff. Once he had it in his hands again, he looked over to see Astrid getting to her feet, wearing an incredulous and quite furious expression. "Jack?" she hissed. "What are you..." "Jaime," Jack said. He got to his feet, ignoring the pain in his wrist. "Jaime's gone." Babytooth tweeted at him to hurry, and Jack followed her without waiting for Astrid's reaction. "What? Jack!" Astrid yelled. She quickly caught up to him, grabbing his arm to make him stop. "What are you talking about? None of the patrollers have seen..." "He's gone," Jack yelled, making Astrid raise her brows, surprised. He tried listening to Babytooth's chirping, shaking his head to clear his mind. He's this way. He was... Wait," he sent Babytooth a wide-eyed look. "Chased by what?" Babytooth chirped helplessly. Astrid was looking at him like he was crazy. "What are you saying?" she hissed. Being visible really had its downsides. "I have to find him," he told Astrid, already moving away from her. "He's in the forest somewhere. He has to be." Astrid couldn't do anything but follow when Jack set into a run again, ignoring her when she tried to stop him. She groaned and sped up to catch up with him. "All right," she said, "but only if you promise me a good reason not to report this straight to Stoic later." Jack didn't bother answering. He ran after Babytooth, out of the village and towards the forest. Babytooth was still trying to explain what happened, and Jack's panic grew by every new piece of information he understood. "In the middle of the night! Why didn't you wake me up?" he yelled at Babytooth. Babytooth squealed apologetically. "Jack, I can't understand you," Astrid snapped. "Would you speak..." She didn't get any further when she spotted 3 figures coming running out of the forest. 3 kids. Jack's eyes widened, but he quickly saw that Jaime was not one of them. "Hey!" Astrid yelled. "You 3! The children came to a stop in front of them, all speaking over one another. Jack picked up something about Jaime and the fact that they split up, and a wild boar. A wild boar? Jack didn't wait to ask them any questions. He ran into the forest. "Jack!" Astrid yelled behind him. Jack faintly heard her groan and tell the kids they were in big trouble before she came running after him. "Where are you going?" "To find Jaime." "Yeah, I got that, but how would you know where you... Look out!" Astrid suddenly grabbed Jack and pulled him out of the way of a thick pine tree he hadn't spotted. Jack winced. He couldn't come up with a believable lie, so he decided to ignore her. "Over here," he ordered, setting into a run again. "Babytooth, wait up! This way, Astrid!" They bolted through the woods. Jack was grateful that even if he didn't have his powers, his agility was still pretty much the same, aside from the almost colliding with the pine tree part. As long as he paid attention, he dodged most trees, stones and boughs, boulders and roots, and everything else Astrid seemed to have trouble dodging. In fact, she seemed to struggle with keeping up. However, since Jack also kept his eyes on Babytooth, it didn't take too long before he tripped and went face first to the ground. He groaned and staggered to his feet as Astrid ran up to help him. "Are you all right?" she and Babytooth asked simultaneously. "Yes, just—" Jack started, but just then Babytooth flew in front of Jack's face before she flickered away, chirping incessantly. Jack didn't say anything more and bolted after her. Astrid sighed and followed. "Jaime!" Jack yelled. There was no response. "Where is he?" Babytooth didn't give a clear answer. "Jaime!" Jack called again, louder this time. "Jaime! Jaime!" Astrid chimed in. Jack strained his ears, trying to hear anything other than their footsteps trampling on the ground. "Come on, Astrid. Slow down, Babytooth. I can't see you in the darkness when you—" Then he heard it. Faint but unmistakable. Jaime's voice. They both came to a sudden stop. Astrid's eyes went wide, and then they were running again. "Jaime!" Jack bellowed. "Where are you?" He heard Jaime's voice again. He was calling for help. Jack sped up, following the sound of Jaime's voice now rather than Babytooth. All of a sudden, Astrid grabbed Jack's arm again. Jack almost yanked his arm away. Couldn't she hear that Jaime was in trouble? But Astrid's grip was too tight. "Cliff," she said before Jack could snap at her. Jack looked back, and his eyes went wide. He hadn't seen because it was so dark and he'd been so focused on following Jaime's voice, but she was right. Just a few meters ahead, a strong wind was blowing into the forest. Jack could hear the sound of the ocean far, far below them. "Jack!" Jack's heart skipped a beat. Jaime's voice. But it was coming from... He bolted forward and kneeled by the edge of the cliff. He squinted, trying to see through the darkness, and then... "Jaime!" he gasped. Miraculously, Jaime was sitting on a narrow, very fragile-looking ledge sticking out of the mountain. Jack couldn't see well in the dark, but when Jaime looked up at the sound of his voice, it looked like he was seriously hurt. There were stains on his face. Was it blood? Jack couldn't tell. "Jack!" Jaime cried. He sounded panicked. "Hurry!" Jack crawled as close as he could get and tried reaching for him, even though he knew it was hopeless. He was way out of reach. Astrid came up beside him and gasped. "I'll call for Stormfly," she said. "Just hold on, Jaime." "No," Jaime protested. "It's breaking. The ledge." There was a horrible cracking sound, and pebbles drizzled off the ledge. Jack didn't even hear them hit the water. He was sure his heart had stopped once again, but he forced the panic away. He had to figure out what to do. He could see a crack in the ledge. They only had a few seconds by the looks of it. No wonder why Babytooth had been in a hurry. "It's okay," Jack said. Jaime stared up at him, completely rigid in panic. Jack's mind was racing. Just try to stand up and reach for my hand." I can't," Jaime stammered. "It's going to fall." "You won't fall," Jack said calmly. He tried for a smile. The crack beneath Jaime was growing larger by the second. "Just stand up, very carefully. Take my hand." "I won't reach," Jaime protested. His voice cracked with fear, and at once another scene played in the back of Jack's head, a scene very similar to this one, but there wouldn't be any hopscotch this time, and they were running out of time. And then Jack remembered what he'd done last time. He grabbed his staff and lowered it to Jaime, the crooked end down. "Hold on to this," he said. Jaime looked at it doubtfully, but then there was another loud crack, and he yelped, latching onto the staff. Jack gritted his teeth and shifted to have a better grip. Astrid sat right beside him, her hands hovering like she wanted to help somehow. And she might have to, too. Jack wasn't sure if he'd be able to carry Jaime's weight, now that he didn't have his powers. "Hold on tight, okay?" Jack said. He wanted to give Jaime a few more seconds to adjust, but in the next moment, the ledge started to crumble. "Jaime!" he cried. Jaime didn't make a sound. Maybe he was too scared to even do that, but he hadn't fallen. He was holding onto the staff, his feet dangling in the air, hopelessly searching for something to stand on. His breath came in sharp, hollow huffs. "Hold on," Jack said, as if that wasn't obvious. He began pulling the staff up. Astrid went behind him, grabbing on as well, and they pulled. "Hurry!" Jaime pleaded, his voice strained. He was shaking with the effort of holding his own weight. They pulled him further up, and Jack soundlessly cursed at how much heavier Jaime was now. Astrid, however, seemed to be doing fine. "Can you hold it on your own?" Jack asked her. Astrid nodded, her face tight. Jack carefully let go of the staff. He crouched, holding out his hand again. Jaime was almost close enough. Just a little bit closer. "You're almost there, Jaime. Just hold on. You're gonna be fine," he said. Jaime didn't answer. He had his eyes clenched shut, his arms shaking. Jack inched forward, trying to reach Jaime's wrist. Just a little more. A little more. Jack gritted his teeth and scooted forward. Jaime gave a weak groan, his voice breaking, and his arms gave out. The staff slipped out of his grip. Astrid yelped as the staff flew off somewhere, but her voice was drowned out by Jaime's scream. But he didn't fall. Jack was holding him up. Jack wasn't sure where the strength came from, but in the next moment he almost effortlessly pulled Jaime up on solid ground. Only later did he realize Astrid had grabbed his leg to keep them both from falling to their deaths. She had single-handedly pulled them both up. Jack had trouble catching his breath. He hadn't been this scared since he'd literally died. He met Jaime's eyes, and Jaime looked too shocked to even cry. He collapsed against Jack, and Jack put his arms around him, burrowing his face in Jaime's hair. "It's okay," he breathed. "You're okay." He glanced up to see Astrid watching them, her face pale. Jack mouthed a "thank you" to her, and she nodded. Baby Tooth came to land on Jack's shoulder. She chirped softly, and Jaime looked up. "Thank you," he murmured. Then he looked at Jack and pressed his lips together. Tears were welling up in his eyes. I'm sorry." Jack just shook his head with a weak chuckle. "It's okay. We can talk later, all right? Just relax." Jaime sniffled, but he nodded. They sat there for a long time. Jaime was shaking so much, Jack doubted he'd be able to stand. Not that Jack himself was doing any better. For a moment there, his heart had beat so fast, he really thought it was going to stop. He'd experienced many horrifying things, and this wasn't the first time Jaime's life had been threatened. It felt different now. Maybe it was just a part of being human. Jaime started to say something, but stopped himself. "What is it?" Jack asked gently. Jaime didn't meet his eyes at first, but he briefly glanced up at him and then at Astrid. Astrid was just standing there, shifting her weight. She looked a bit awkward, her eyes shifting like she didn't know where to rest them, but apparently she didn't mind waiting for Jaime to calm down. Jack thought he knew what Jaime was thinking. "The other kids?" he asked. Jaime nodded reluctantly, like he had to force himself. Jack couldn't help but smile. Despite everything, Jaime didn't want to get the other kids in trouble. He was loyal like that, maybe a little too loyal. "They're safe. We met them on our way here. They said..." Jack hesitated because the story almost seemed too dangerous to be true. But then again, the kids had been really freaked out. There was, of course, a chance they'd been lying. Maybe they had done something they regretted, maybe by accident, and maybe not. A prank gone wrong. Jack knew children could be cruel, but he didn't want to consider that option yet. "They said you were attacked by a wild boar." Jaime pressed his lips together and nodded. "A wild boar," Astrid repeated, her voice flat and doubtful. "Do you realize how dangerous those are?" Jaime sent her a look. "I'm not lying," he said. He sounded slightly annoyed. Jack guessed nobody liked being accused of lying when that wasn't the case, but Jaime had even more reason than most kids after the events of last Easter. He took a shaky breath. "There was a pig? A wild boar, I mean. Anders tried to shoot it with an arrow, but she missed, so we ran and..." His voice faltered. His hand tightened where it was gripping onto Jack's hoodie. "It followed me, so I just ran. I didn't see the cliff before it was too late, so I fell over. I landed on that ledge, but the pig wasn't so lucky." He mumbled the last part like he felt sorry for it. Jack's eyes widened. He glanced at Astrid, who looked just as surprised. "You killed a wild boar," she said. Jaime's eyes flickered between her and Jack like he'd done something wrong. "It was an accident," he protested. Jack couldn't help but laugh, but he stopped himself when Jaime gave him a confused look. "You really are full of surprises," he told him, and gently ruffled his hair. Jaime still looked unsure, and Jack smiled reassuringly. "I'm just glad you're all right," he told him. Jamie's lips quirked up into a small smile too. Then he looked down at his hands, which were covered in mud and blood. "Mostly," he mumbled. Astrid took a few steps away from the edge and picked up something. Jack's staff. She walked back to them and handed it to him. "We should get back to the village and clean your wounds," she said. "Are you hurt anywhere else, Jamie? Any broken bones?" Jamie hesitated, but shook his head. "I don't think so," he said. "And you, Jack?" "I'm all right," Jack said, and began shifting to get to his feet. "But we should still—" "Oh!" Astrid had grabbed his left arm. Her touch was gentle, but still it sent a jolt of pain through his wrist. She raised an eyebrow at him and carefully turned his arm over. Jack stared at it. It looked almost blue. Was it blue? "Can you move it?" she asked. Jack tried, and his hand moved weakly up and down. It hurt, but it was possible. Astrid hummed. "Doesn't seem to be broken, but you should definitely bandage it," she said, then glanced down at Jack's feet. "And those too. Hiccup gave you those shoes for a reason, Jack." She sent him a disapproving look. Jack followed her gaze, and his breath hitched in his throat. Like Jamie's hands, Jack's feet were covered in mud and blood. He hadn't even noticed that he'd cut himself, but there was a gash at the side of his left foot, and only now did he notice that both of them actually really hurt. He guessed it wasn't such a good idea to sprint through the woods with bare feet anymore. Jack felt unwell. His head felt like it was filled with cotton. It took him a long while to look away from the red on his skin, and he only did it because Astrid was trying to get his attention. "Are you okay?" she asked, frowning at him. "Don't tell me you're a fainter. It's just a bit of blood." Jack had trouble finding his voice. "What?" No, I just—" He trailed off, not knowing how to explain the feeling he was having. Jamie might have understood, at least somewhat. Babytooth, maybe even more. Astrid was more problematic. The thing was, Jack hadn't seen his own blood for 300 years, and seeing it now was jarring. Like he just now realized that he really was mortal again. But how could he explain that? He gave a breathy, half-hearted laugh. "I mean, I'm not a fainter, but—" Astrid shook her head and got to her feet. "Come on," she said, holding out her hand. "Get used to it. You'll see a lot of it here in Berg." "That's not exactly reassuring," Jack mumbled, but took her hand anyway, before helping Jamie to his feet. He was giving Jack a strange look, but he didn't say anything. "Let's go to my place," Astrid said, briefly touching Jack's shoulder. "I'll save you the trip back to Gothi's hut." The gentle touch was deceiving, but Jack understood. It wasn't an offer, it was an order. Jack shared a look with Jamie, who just shrugged. "Not going up that hill would be nice," he admitted. Jack smiled and nodded at Astrid. "Thank you." Astrid smiled back and gestured for them to follow. They were quiet on their way back. Astrid walked slightly ahead, her gaze fixed determinedly forward like she was thinking hard about something. Sometimes she would glance at Jamie and her eyes would soften. Jack got a feeling she was weighing her options. She had to report back to her chief, but she also wanted to make sure Jamie was all right. He'd already been through enough for a little while. Jamie was holding onto Jack's left arm, careful not to touch his wrist, but his grip was tight, as if he was still afraid of falling. He was sniffling, but the few tears he'd shed earlier had stopped long ago. Jack suspected he was trying to seem strong in front of him and Astrid. Jack would have been a hypocrite for blaming him, because he was doing the exact same thing. The memories of Jack's last moments as a human were still playing relentlessly in the back of his mind. A conversation might have drowned it out, but he had trouble coming up with anything to say. The world around him seemed somehow distant. The only thing that felt truly real was Jamie's grip on his arm. Astrid's house was pretty homey, if you didn't notice the weapons decorating the wall. Her family was fond of axes, it seemed. Still, it was more inviting than Gothi's hut, with a hearth in the middle of the room, fur-covered benches, and the lack of a witch corner, which was definitely a huge plus. Astrid made Jack and Jamie sit by the hearth, which was already lit. She explained that her mom was on patrol duty and her father was out to sea for the time being. Apparently, not everyone had taken to dragon riding, and some Burkians still preferred to do things the traditional way. While Astrid was out getting water, Jack grabbed a woolen blanket from one of the beds. He draped it over Jamie's shoulders and sat down beside him. Jamie stirred, but didn't look up. And then there was silence. Jack felt unsure, more unsure than he had in a long time, at least when it came to Jaime. And he felt like a fraud, because it was kind of his job to be able to figure out kids and how to cheer them up, how to have fun. But this wasn't fun. All of this had somehow been even more jarring than the fight with Pitch. Without his powers, he truly almost lost Jaime, and that thought was paralyzing. It had happened so quickly, and Jack had only been lucky. His body felt like it was filled with lead. It felt like he'd already failed after just 3 days. Baby Tooth landed on Jack's knee, worriedly looking up at him. Jack tried to smile at her, but he knew it was empty. It was almost too scary to wonder what Jaime might be thinking. He wasn't Jack Frost anymore, the hero that Jaime had put his faith in. He was just a normal, powerless teenager. "Are you angry?" Jack blinked, looking up. He hadn't realized he'd been frowning. Jaime's gaze was wary and his posture stiff. It was a strange look, especially when directed at Jack. His lower lip was also quivering ever so slightly, and his voice was hoarse and quiet. Jack raised his brows. "What?" was his encouraging answer. Jaime pouted, averting his eyes. He looked like he was struggling to find the right words, but Jack spared him the trouble. "Jaime," he said, a light chuckle in his voice. It made Jaime look up again. There was a slight shimmer in his eyes, and Jack shook his head. "Why would I be angry?" Jack swallowed and looked down again. "Because he started. His voice was thin. "My mom always yells at me when I stay out late, especially in the woods. I shouldn't have snuck out, but I did anyway, and I almost, Hey, it's all right," Jack interrupted as Jaime's voice rose, quavering with emotion. He shifted so that his legs were on either side of the bench, facing Jaime. He ignored the pain in his left wrist to cup Jaime's hand in both of his own. "Listen, you're right. Your mother's also right. What you did was very dangerous, and you shouldn't do that, ever again." Jaime pressed his quivering lips together. A tear rolled down his cheek. Jack swallowed. "But sometimes we do reckless things," he continued. "And sometimes those things have awful consequences. I mean, you already know I've made some bad choices." Jaime looked up again, a frown on his face. "The time fragment wasn't your fault," he argued softly. That was debatable, but Jack couldn't help but smile at Jaime's unrelenting faith. "Even so, there's been other events," Jack said quietly, looking down. The sound of ice skates was still clear in his mind, and he shook his head, meeting Jaime's eyes again. "What I'm saying is that everyone finds himself in trouble like this sometimes. It's not something you can avoid that easily, unless you want to live a boring life in fear of ever encountering it." Jaime frowned, but a smile was creeping onto his face. "Are you saying getting into trouble is okay?" he asked. Jack laughed. "Well, sort of, I guess. My mom wouldn't have liked that message." "She probably wouldn't," Jack agreed, squeezing Jaime's hand. "And she's probably right to disagree. You should try to listen to both of us. Find a nice balance, you know?" Jaime nodded. His smile faltered a little. "You're not going to yell at me?" he asked. "I think that pig already taught you a lesson." Jaime shuddered a little. He looked over at Baby Tooth. "If it hadn't been for you—" He started shakily. His hand twitched like he wasn't sure what to do with her. He couldn't exactly hug someone who was the size of his own hand, but Baby Tooth seemed to understand because she flew over and landed on Jaime's shoulder, chirping gently at him. Jaime sent Jack a questioning look. Jack chuckled. "She says it's fine." Baby Tooth chirped again. "But don't do it again." Jaime laughed, and just then Astrid came back. She was carrying 2 buckets of water. "Here," she said, putting the buckets down in front of them, along with a couple of rags. She then walked over to a chest and rummaged around in it before pulling up what looked like bandages and something else, a splint. She came back and sat next to Jack, gesturing for him to hold out his hand. He let her work silently on bandaging his wrist, trying not to wince too much. "There," she said when she finished. "Wash your legs while I clean Jaime's wounds." Jack just nodded. Astrid clearly knew what she was doing, which made him wonder how many times she'd fixed herself up, and possibly other people as well. He took one of the rags and dipped it in water. "That's straight from the well, so it's pretty cold," Astrid warned. Jack glanced at Jaime, and a laughing smile spread on Jamie's lips. Jack chuckled and nodded. "Noted," he said. Astrid frowned. "What's so funny?" "Nothing, just an inside joke." She didn't seem satisfied with the answer, but just shook her head and dipped her rag in the water. Cleaning the wounds was slow and painful work, and for each time he winced, Jack wished he hadn't taken his fast healing for granted all those years. Of course, if he'd known you wouldn't always have accelerated healing, he might have appreciated it more. But he wouldn't dwell on that. Not right now, anyway. He had loads of time to glower at the moon. "Astrid?" Jack said. "How long does it take for this to heal?" "Don't know. Maybe a few weeks, couple of months. Depends on the person and the damage." Jack blinked. "Weeks?" he repeated incredulously. Astrid stopped dabbing at Jamie's forehead to give him a weird look. "Something tells me you don't have much experience with injury," she said. It wasn't exactly true. "Well, not exactly the kind you—" Jaime elbowed him slightly, and Jack stopped talking. He was smiling. "Normal people don't have super healing abilities," Jaime said in English. Jack huffed. "They sure don't," he agreed in a disgruntled mumble. Astrid was looking at them both, her eyes slightly narrowed, as if she was trying to will her brain to understand the foreign language. Jaime bit his lip. "Sorry," he mumbled. "It's probably rude to keep you out of the conversation." Jaime had more common decency than Jack, at least. Thankfully, because Astrid's expression softened immediately. "Just a little tip," she said. "If you want to seem unsuspicious, not speaking in foreign tongues in front of our faces will probably help. You're plotting to overthrow Stoic for all I know. If you got nothing to hide, then—" She shrugged. Jack kept his face even. To be fair, they did have something to hide. It just wasn't anywhere near what Astrid feared. "Point taken," Jack said. "Norse it is." Astrid smiled approvingly, then continued dabbing at Jamie's face. "Are you hurting anywhere else?" she asked. "That was quite the fall you had." "I had worse," Jaime replied with a small smile. "Maybe not quite as scary, but one time I went flying through the air on a sledge." He moved his hand through the air to visualize. "Then I got run over by a couch, but it was like a really long leap." Jack hummed. "It was pretty impressive," he agreed. "Sounds like you two have been through a lot together," Astrid said absent-mindedly as she studied Jamie's face and hands. She hummed thoughtfully. "You'll be bruised up for a few days, but your cuts aren't that deep. Maybe if you're lucky, you'll still get a scar out of it." She winked at him before getting to her feet, throwing the rag back in the bucket. Jaime sent Jack a confused look, and Jack shrugged. These Vikings really were something. "How's your wrist?" Astrid asked. Jack turned his hand over. It ached, and he was sure it would just ache more in the days to come. He tried moving it, sucking the air through his teeth, and suddenly he was gone. Not physically, but his mind was far away, in a different place and a different time. It hadn't been his wrist back then, but his ankle. He remembered. He couldn't have been more than 13 at the time. He'd been entertaining the other kids, climbing a branch, and then snap. It hadn't been the first time Jack had injured himself, nor would it be the last, but this injury had forced him to use crutches for a while, and even stay in bed the first few days. It had been a miserable few months. "Huh," he muttered. He looked up to see that both Astrid and Jaime were giving him strange looks. He smiled. "Doesn't hurt as much anymore. I realized I've had worse." "You realized?" Astrid asked. When Jack didn't elaborate, she just snorted. "Okay, then." Jaime didn't say anything, still looking at Jack. It was kind of a thoughtful look. Jack found it hard to read, so he pretended not to notice. "Well, you're both doing better than I expected, especially Jaime," Astrid said, smiling at them. "Maybe there's a bit of Viking in you after all." Jaime beamed. Then she turned to Jack and frowned. "You're cold," she said. Jack blinked. "What? No." "You're shivering," Astrid insisted. Jack realized only then that she was right. He'd been feeling a bit uncomfortable for a while, but he'd been too focused on cleaning his wounds to actually think about what it was. Turns out it was just because it was slightly chilly, even with the hearth warming them up. Being human was more of a hassle than he remembered. Astrid was frowning now. "I wonder," she mumbled. "Hold on." And then she turned and disappeared out the front door. Jack and Jaime shared confused looks, and Jack just shrugged. It didn't take too long before Astrid came back, now carrying a heap of clothes. She threw the pile on the bench, then placed her hand on her hips, self-satisfied. "Where'd you get those?" Jack asked. "Storage shed," she explained. "Extra clothes in case someone is in need. And since you'll be staying for a while, it's time you dressed more appropriately, don't you think?" She surveyed them both. "No offense, but your clothes are super weird. What even is that fabric?" She pointed at Jaime's vest. Jaime's mouth opened and closed. I don't know," he said. "My mom got it for me." "Well, you should try these on, and I can get your shoes from Gothi's, Jack," Astrid said. "That you somehow forgot about on your way out." "I was in a hurry," Jack defended. "Yeah, that explains it," Astrid said dryly, before she headed out the door again. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. It didn't take that long to get to Gothi's hut if you had a dragon, so Jack supposed she was giving them extra time to get dressed. He was at a slight loss for words. Astrid had really committed to the kind and caring part. It stood in sharp contrast with the hard and calculating behavior she'd had before. And Jack wasn't really used to being taken care of. It was coming to the point where it was almost uncomfortable, like North and Bunny's behavior after the Heat Sprite incident. "She's nicer than I thought," he mumbled once she was out. "Yeah," Jaime agreed with a small laugh. He was already looking through the pile of clothes with enthusiasm, though he was careful not to move his bandaged hands too much. He picked out some garments, then grinned at Jack. "You should wear this. It's blue." Jack frowned. "What is it?" "Dunno, a sash or something? Oh, look at this. It looks like something from Pirates of the Caribbean." "Kind of." Jack didn't know what Jaime was talking about, but he nodded as if he did. He looked through the pile as well, and soon enough they'd found some clothes that hopefully fit them. Before 10 minutes has passed, they were both all dressed up in old, dusty Viking clothes. Jack wound up in a baggy white blouse that was a bit too big, so he rolled it up to his elbows. He also found some fingerless gloves, which helped with keeping warm, but like with his feet, Jack didn't like covering his hands. He found brown pants with leg wraps around the ankles, a bit like the ones he was already wearing. The faded blue sash Jaime had found hugged his waist comfortably, both to keep warm and to stop his new blouse from riding up his stomach. However, his favorite garment was a long brown cloak. It was wrapped around his shoulders, fastened at the side of his chest, so that the frayed cape hung lopsidedly down his back, ending somewhere behind his thighs. It reminded him vaguely of the cloak he'd worn during his first years as Jack Frost. It made him feel a little bit more at home. Then he turned around to see what clothes Jaime had ended up in, and his heart almost leaped to his throat. Jaime was wearing a brown tunic and a sash like Jack, only it was a soft red instead of a faded blue. He'd also found himself grey pants and was still wearing his own shoes. It was a very unassuming look, nothing special about it. Jack had seen very similar outfits in several villages already, and yet, when he saw Jaime in those clothes, he was struck with a feeling he couldn't decide whether it was elevating or devastating. Jaime looked almost like a mirror image of Jack's sister Emily. His outfit looked like the dress Emily had been wearing that day. It was the last thing Jack had seen before going through the ice. Slowly, he realized that Jaime was trying to say something to him, and he blinked himself back to the present, or past, or whatever this was for them right now. "Huh?" Jaime tilted his head questioningly to the side. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. Jack almost said that he felt like he had, but remained silent. Jaime glanced behind himself, and then at Jack again, like he was afraid there really was a ghost behind him. "Is something wrong?" Jack took a slightly shaky breath. "No," he said. "I just thought of something." He smiled and came over to sit on the bench again, beside Jaime. "How do you feel?" he asked, before Jaime could ask any more questions about Jack's weird tendency to space out. Jaime looked puzzled, but didn't ask. Instead, he tilted his chin up. "Like a Viking," he replied with a grin. "Didn't I ask them to be careful?" "Maybe I didn't directly ask it, but I'm sure it was clearly implied. They're already mistrusted by the entire village, and what do? Sneak out to the woods and kill a boar?" Hiccup groaned, falling backwards on Toothless for a moment, before sitting up again. Toothless grumbled in agreement. At least, Hiccup liked to pretend he was agreeing. "And why do I have to hear it from Astrid? When were they so friendly?" he mumbled. Toothless huffed. Hiccup did too. "Well, I'm sure they have a perfectly good explanation," he then said. Right. Toothless made a sound that sounded slightly doubtful. Hiccup sighed. No, you're probably right. There's never an explanation with those guys. They landed outside the forge, where Astrid had told him Jack and Jaime might be. It was already the middle of the day, and Hiccup had been too busy training, or goofing around as Astrid liked to call it, to check on Jack and Jaime. Time really flew by when you were up in the air, and suddenly it was time to gather the guys to prepare for the next dragon race. It had all been a fun time, until Astrid dropped the bomb that Jaime had almost died last night. Hiccup jumped off Toothless and headed for the forge, but came to a stop when he spotted Jack. He was leaning against a pillar with his back to Hiccup and clearly hadn't noticed him coming. The thing that initially made Hiccup stop was the fact Jack had a wardrobe change. He almost looked like a normal Burkian now. But the thing that kept Hiccup from walking up to him was how he was just standing there, muttering to himself with his palm out in front of him. He made weird hand motions like he was moving his fingers through water. His other hand was bandaged, holding his staff. Hiccup glanced at Toothless before he quietly walked up to Jack. As he got closer, he saw that Jack's brows were furrowed, and he was looking intently at his hand, like it had developed its own will and was disobeying. And then suddenly, that intense gaze flickered to Hiccup. Hiccup stopped in his tracks. Jack's expression immediately turned to surprise at the sight of him. Hiccup started. Hand cramp? Jack shook his hand and let it fall. Yep, he said, and a carefree smile spread on his face. What's up? What's up? Hiccup repeated exasperatedly. What are you... He stopped himself at the sound of someone whispering slightly to his left. He looked, but saw only a small carriage filled with potatoes. But he had also caught a glimpse of black hair just behind the carriage. He sighed and walked over to it. Are you guys spying on Jack? He asked. Go! Someone hissed, and 3 children ran for it. They would have gotten away hadn't it been for Toothless, who blocked their path. The children shrieked, halfway scared and halfway delighted to see Toothless, but seemed to admit defeat because at least they didn't try to run in the other direction. Hiccup recognized them as the kids Astrid had told him about earlier. Brand, Anders, and Hildur. He crossed his arms, raising his brow in a silent question. We were just playing hide-and-seek, Brand said. Hiccup sent him a doubtful look. And who's seeking? He challenged. You guys were there the entire time? Jack asked behind Hiccup, like he actually had been playing hide-and-seek. I didn't notice you at all. Hiccup ignored him. I heard 4 kids snuck out to the woods last night, Hiccup said, shooting the kids a pointed look. The children shared glances before they came closer, all wearing different degrees of nervous expressions. Hiccup was about to chastise them, but the loud voice of Gobber spoke up before he had the chance. I heard that too, he said with a laugh as he came out of the forge, unsuccessfully wiping soot off his forehead. And that little Jaime fought his first wild boar. For some reason, Brand looked close to tears. He suddenly ran up to Jack and grabbed his new clothes, looking up at him with a devastated look. It wasn't our fault, Jack, he pleaded miserably. Tears were streaming down his face now. We didn't know there would be any wild boars that close to the village, I swear. We didn't mean to. Jack looked completely bewildered, and he interrupted him before he could go any further. Hey, he said, a slightly worried chuckle in his voice. He kneeled in front of Brand. Calm down, it's okay. Breathe. He glanced up at Hiccup, asking a silent question. Hiccup just shrugged and looked at the other kids. They looked pale and wouldn't meet his eyes. Once Brand had calmed down a little bit, Jack sent him a kind smile, putting a hand on his shoulder. There you go. Know what's wrong? Brand sniffled. We left Jaime, he said quietly. The wild boar chased him. We should have followed and helped him, but oh, it's you guys. Brand's eyes went wide. Anders and Hildur looked up with horrified expressions as Jaime emerged from the forge, his cheeks red from the heat and his forehead sweaty. Hildur grabbed a hold of Anders so hard she yelped. You're alive! Hildur shrieked. You're alive? Brand asked at the same time. Anders didn't say anything, but her mouth was hanging open. Jaime looked almost just as surprised as the other kids. His eyes darted to Jack, and then to Brand, whose eyes were still teary. Yeah? He said. Anders stepped forward. But the boar, she said. You killed the boar? Jaime's cheeks seemed to be growing redder, but this time it wasn't because of the heat. Well, actually, he started, but Gobber interrupted. Your first boar, he said, looking up at the sky wistfully. I remembered when I killed my first boar. I think I was 13 at the time. Not a bad age, but it seems my record has been broken. Well, I'm sure Stoic killed his first boar when he was a newborn, but that's Stoic. Wait, Jack said with a frown. He looked at Brant again. You thought Jaime... He trailed off. And you came here to apologize? Suddenly, Brant looked extremely uncomfortable. I gotta go, he said, then turned on his heel and ran. Anders and Hilda looked like they still wanted to question Jaime, but one of their teammates had left the mission. Apparently, it was time to abort. We'll talk later, Anders told Jaime before they both scampered off. Hiccup looked after them and sighed deeply. I wish I could run away from my problems like that, he muttered. Jaime was looking after them too, and then at Jack. He laughed, slightly nervous, before just as quickly stopping himself. He looked up at Gobber. You don't really believe I killed that boar, do you? He asked. Gobber winked at him. What do I know? I wasn't there, he said, then nodded for Jaime to follow him back inside. Come on, little Borslea. We have a sword to forge. You too, Jack. Jack seemed a bit bewildered still, but he looked up when Gobber said his name. He followed absent-mindedly, and Hiccup had no choice but to do so too, if he wanted to have a word with them. He signaled to Toothless that he would be right back. Gobber pulled a long piece of iron out of the kiln and placed it on the anvil. All right, lad, he said to a wide-eyed Jaime. Now it's time to hammer the edges. Hold it like this, and then you should be fine. No, not there, unless you want to burn your fingers off. Jaime swallowed. He was wearing gloves, but they weren't much protection against glowing hot iron. Jack was watching, his expression only halfway neutral. It was clear he thought that was fascinating too, but he was, understandably, worried for Jaime. Hiccup was worried too. He remembered what it was like being a beginner apprentice with Gobber. But he turned out fine, so Jaime probably would too. He turned to Jack. Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in? He asked quietly, so that Gobber and Jaime wouldn't hear over the hammering. Jack didn't meet his eyes at first, but the smile growing on his lips told Hiccup he'd heard him. He sent him an impish look. Do tell, he said. This isn't funny, Jack, Hiccup said. You could have gotten hurt. You could have died. Jack snorted. We wouldn't want that, would we? Hiccup stared at him. What's the matter with you? He demanded. Jack looked ready to come up with some snarky reply, but then seemed to stop himself at the last moment. He closed his mouth and visibly exhaled. Sorry, he mumbled, bringing both his hands around his staff. It's been a long day, and night before that. Hiccup took a step closer, then gently turned Jack around so they could have a bit more privacy. They walked over to a spot in the forge that didn't have sparks flying through the air. What happened? Hiccup asked. My dad will find out sooner or later, and he's not as forgiving as Astrid. Astrid is really nice, Jack said, like that helped him in the slightest. He caught Hiccup's stare and sighed. There's no good explanation. Brant, Anders, and Hilda came to Gothi's hut in the middle of the night and convinced Jaime to sneak out with them. I was asleep, so... The last part came out in a mumble. He sounded ashamed, like, how dare he sleep during the night like everyone else. And Jaime killed a boar, Hiccup said, just for confirmation. Jack looked like he was trying to suppress a smile, but didn't do a very good job at it. I kinda want to believe that, he said, his reluctant smile turning into a laughing grin. It's more fun that way, isn't it? Hiccup raised his brows. Jack was acting so aloof, it felt like he was dealing with Snotlout, or even rough or tough, and that was not a compliment. But the weird thing was, Hiccup found himself fighting a smile too, despite how much he tried to seem like the serious chiefy type. Jack's attitude was annoyingly infectious. They can believe whatever they want, Hiccup said, forcing himself to stay serious. But I want to know what really happened. Jack's smile melted, and Hiccup was a bit sad to see it go. Once the playful twinkle in his eyes was gone, he suddenly seemed older and weary. He let out another deep sigh, looking over at Jaime and Gobber. The boar chased Jaime off a cliff. None of them saw the cliff in time. Jaime miraculously landed on a ledge. Astrid and I barely managed to save him. A cold feeling spread on Hiccup's chest. To think the call had been that close? And the boar? he asked. His voice came out smaller than he'd intended. Jack shrugged. Took a swim, I guess. Hiccup let out a shaky breath. Gods, he muttered. You've been here for 3 days and you've already had a near-death experience. Tell me about it, Jack mumbled, bringing a hand to his temple. I can't remember the last time I had a headache this bad. At least, Gobber is distracting enough, though. He peered over at them, his brows furrowing. Not sure if it'll end well for Jaime. Hiccup followed his gaze. Jaime looked extremely awkward, standing beside the huge anvil and holding a hammer that was much too heavy for him, and Hiccup couldn't help but smile. The sight was almost nostalgic. He'll be fine, he told Jack. But Jack wasn't paying attention. His eyes were still on Jaime, though it didn't seem like he was truly looking at him either. His mind was elsewhere. Yeah, he eventually replied, blinking as he looked back at Hiccup. He smiled faintly. He'll be fine. Hiccup decided there and then that Jack wasn't much of an actor. They didn't know each other, and Hiccup could be unobservant sometimes, but he'd always been pretty good at reading others' emotions. After all, it was that ability that had made him spare Toothless' life when he'd found him down in the woods. However, Toothless was a dragon. They were somewhat easier to communicate with than people, a whole lot of the time. Jack, Hiccup started. Jack looked at him, and suddenly he realized that he didn't actually know any way to help. He just wanted to help somehow. Well, I'll talk to my dad and figure something out. And I just wanted to say that... Jack, come over here, lad. Gobber's voice made them both jump. Jack laughed about it, while Hiccup sent Gobber a slight glower, bringing a hand to his startled heart. But he guessed it was for the best. He hadn't actually known what he was going to say to Jack just then. Gobber went on to show Jack how to make a blade from scratch, while Jaime continued struggling with the sword he was currently working on. Hiccup could already tell it wouldn't turn out very good, but Jaime's enthusiasm was something to admire. Then Hiccup noticed the bandages on his hands, and he realized why he was holding the hammer so awkwardly. Was he actually in pain? Hiccup found himself walking over to him. Jaime was wearing an adorably focused expression, nose wrinkled and brows furrowed, but he stopped hammering once he noticed Hiccup looking at him. Am I doing it wrong? Jaime asked, his expression morphing into self-consciousness. Hiccup hesitated. Not really, he said, leaning over to study Jaime's handiwork. It's a bit... It wasn't very good, but still a good first try, probably. Wobbly. You'll get the hang of it in no time, I'm sure. Jaime hummed. He started to scratch his cheek in contemplation, but then winced, and Hiccup realized it wasn't just his hands that were injured. His face had a few cuts and bruises, partly hidden underneath the soot that smeared his face after working in the forge all day. Jack had told Hiccup it had been a long day and night. He could only wonder what Jaime must be feeling, and yet he was here, making swords. He really was a trooper. You know, Gobber is a bit, much sometimes, but you can take a break if you're tired, Hiccup told him. Jaime looked up at him, and then at the sword. He shrugged. I want to have a sword, he said. It's cool. Well, maybe not this one, but... He sounded pretty dejected. Hiccup glanced over at Gobber and Jack. They weren't paying attention. Not that Gobber would chastise Jaime if he saw Hiccup helping him, but he'd never been a very gentle teacher. Hiccup wanted to show Jaime the way he liked to work. Want me to help you a little? He asked Jaime. Jaime's eyes widened. You would? He asked, looking down at the sword again. Just to at least make it look like a sword? Hiccup chuckled. Sure. Hold on, we need to reheat this. He grabbed the wobbly piece of iron. As he moved it back to the kiln, he glanced over at Jack and Gobber again to make sure they weren't still paying attention, but instead met eyes with Jack. Jack only looked at him for a moment, an amused smile spreading on his face, before Gobber took away his attention again. When did you start working in the forge? Jaime asked, as Hiccup shoved the blade into the kiln. I think I was a little younger than you, he said. At least that's when I made my first weapons. Jaime made an O with his mouth. Wasn't it hard? He then asked. Oh yeah, I wasn't any good at first, Hiccup said, smiling at the memory. Gobber started to teach me because he looked at my designs. Though I might have a talent for forging and crafting since he hadn't really had a talent for anything else. Dragon fighting wasn't exactly my forte. Jaime looked over at Toothless, who was waiting outside. Hiccup knew he would probably get grumpy, since they'd had to cut the dragon race preparation short. But they could continue doing that later. "Why did you stop fighting them?" Jaime asked. Hiccup wondered how much of that story he had the energy to retell. He sent Jaime a light smile. "We just had to learn their side of the story first," he said. "And once we saw the whole picture, we learned that we didn't have to be enemies. We could help each other and be friends." Jaime was fidgeting with his hands. Clearly, he had something on his mind. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then opened it again. "Could I ride a dragon?" he asked. Hiccup hesitated. Jaime sounded so hopeful, but Hiccup knew he had to disappoint him. Not just because Stoic wouldn't want to teach Jack and Jaime anything about dragons before he knew he could trust them, but also because Jaime was so young. The latter truth seemed less harsh, so Hiccup went with that. "I was 15 when I first learned how to ride a dragon," he said. "You're still a bit young." Jaime pouted, and Hiccup smiled apologetically. "Maybe when you're older," he tried. "That's 4 years," Jaime said. If Hiccup didn't imagine it, slight distress passed over his expression. "We're not going to stay here that long?" "Oh." Hiccup glanced at Jack again, but this time Jack was busy listening to Gobber explain the difference between a normal iron and Gronkle iron. Hiccup had never been very good with kids. He wasn't horrible, but they had a tendency to walk all over him, like everyone else had done before he defeated the Red Death. It was a long time ago now, but he had never quite figured out how kids worked. They were too unpredictable. Still, Jaime seemed like a nice kid, and since Jack was busy, Hiccup couldn't very well leave him to deal with his inner turmoil alone. He glanced at the kiln and decided the blade could sit a bit longer. He kneeled in front of Jaime, trying to seem less uncertain than he really was. "You miss home?" he asked him. Jaime looked up before he too glanced at Jack, as if he was worried he'd hear. He shrugged uneasily. "I guess," he said. "It hasn't been that long, though. It's okay." "How long exactly?" Jaime was about to answer, but then he frowned. He hesitated. "Time is complicated," he mumbled, scratching his cheek again, careful not to touch a cut this time. "I mean, if you think about it..." His brows furrowed even more, like whatever he was thinking about was extremely confusing. Hiccup supposed memory loss would do that to you. "Well, either way," Hiccup said with a small chuckle. "It's okay to miss home even if it hasn't been that long. But I'm sure we'll find a way to get you back soon." Jaime's confused expression turned to doubt as he looked back at Hiccup again. "Your dad won't let us go," he said. Hiccup pressed his lips together. That was a very good point. "Yeah, well..." He nervously pushed some hair out of his face. "He'll probably come around when he realizes you don't mean any harm." "Do you think we mean harm?" Jaime asked, looking Hiccup directly in the eyes. Hiccup hesitated again. This kid didn't beat around the bush. As the son of the chief, the answer should be that he wouldn't take any chances until he was sure. But as just Hiccup, he shook his head. "No, I can't say I do," he said. Jaime nodded. "Good," he said seriously, and leaned closer. "Because if you think Jack is going to hurt you in any way, you're not a very good judge of character." Hiccup couldn't help but smile. He shrugged. "Doesn't hurt to be careful, don't you think?" he asked. "I don't know him, after all." It was Jaime's turn to smile. It was the smile of someone who knew something Hiccup didn't. "No, you don't," he said. It was hard to say what that smile meant exactly, but Hiccup decided it was just Jaime trying to seem cool or mature, the way kids did. So instead of commenting on it, he straightened back up and turned to the kiln. "Right," he said. "Let's forge this plate." He let Jaime hammer some of it, taking over sometimes just to fix the worst of the damage, but only when he was sure Gobber had his back turned. Jack had seemed to catch on to Hiccup's little game because he was doing a very good job at keeping Gobber's attention. By the time Gobber finally came back to check on Jaime's work, his eyebrows raised in surprise, and then furrowed in suspicion. "That's a lot better than I expected," he said, sending Hiccup a long look. Hiccup shrugged. "You must be a natural," he said. Jaime's smile was slightly nervous, but still wide and very amused. Hiccup counted that as a victory. Maybe he was better with kids than he thought. Gobber's eyes narrowed. He looked between the two of them for a few seconds before he grinned a toothy grin. "All right then, lad," he said, patting Jaime on the back so hard he stumbled forward, but Jaime just laughed. "While this cools down, I'll show you how we make the hilt. Meanwhile, you lads can wait outside," he sent Hiccup a pointed look. Hiccup held back a laugh and sent a knowing smile to Jaime. Jaime beamed back at him. And so Hiccup and Jack padded out of the forge at Copper's orders. Toothless perked up hopefully when they came outside, burbling something that sounded like some kind of question. "Soon, bud," Hiccup answered before turning to Jack. He wasn't sure what he had intended to say to him, but either way, he forgot all about it when he noticed that Jack was sending him an inquisitive look. Hiccup suddenly felt self-conscious. "Do I have something on my face?" he asked, only half joking. Jack's eyes twinkled with mirth. "Yes, but that's not what I was thinking about," he said. Before Hiccup could ask him where on his face, Jack continued. "I thought you didn't trust us." Hiccup raised his brows. "You heard that?" "My hearing's pretty good," Jack said. "What do you think these big ears are for?" Hiccup gave a surprised laugh. They're not that big," he protested. Jack grinned, taking a couple of steps closer. "Thank you," he said. "For saying your ears aren't big?" "No, not..." Jack laughed again, his head falling to the side for a moment. "For that too, I guess. But I meant for talking to Jaime." His smile melted a little. He shifted his hold on the staff, something he seemed to do a lot when he was nervous or uncomfortable. "He tries hard to put up a brave front, but..." He glanced into the forge, but they couldn't see Jaime from where they were standing. Jack seemed to be struggling to find the right words. "To be honest, I'm not sure how to cheer him up after what happened," he then admitted quietly. Hiccup nodded slowly. "That's okay," he said, a bit uncertainly. "Right? Even if he is your brother, you can't always know." Jack glanced at him before he looked down at the ground. "It's a bit more complicated than that," he muttered, but didn't offer any further explanation. "How so?" Hiccup asked gently. "The way he smiled when you worked with him, though," Jack said, smoothly ignoring Hiccup's question. "That was genuine, so thank you for that." Hiccup shrugged as if to say, "No problem." "Jaime's not the only one who tries to put up a brave front," he said. Jack met his eyes. He didn't say or do anything for a few seconds, but studied Hiccup like he was reading his thoughts. Then he shrugged as well. "It's what big brothers do," he said. His eyes drifted over his staff, and he twirled it absent-mindedly in his hand. "I just wish I wasn't so..." He trailed off, but Hiccup was pretty sure the end of that sentence wouldn't end with something particularly narcissistic. Hiccup tried not to fidget. He didn't know what to say or do to make Jack feel better. The fact was just that Burr could be a dangerous place, and he still didn't know when they'd be able to help Jack and Jaime get back home. Up until this point, Jack had acted cheerful and optimistic, if not a little aloof and strange sometimes. Now, Hiccup was starting to wonder if that was all an act. I'm sure you're doing your best, Jack," he said, trying to sound encouraging. "What happened to Jaime wasn't your fault." It took a few seconds before Jack answered. Hiccup's words only seemed to darken his mood further. "I can't stay like this," he then said, his voice just a whisper. Hiccup wasn't sure what he meant, but Jack sounded so desperately lost, he scrambled for something to say. Just a few encouraging words would be nice, but nothing seemed to come to mind, except for a question from a long time ago. At least it had helped Hiccup back then. It was the best he had. "What are you going to do about it?" he asked. Jack looked up at him, and Hiccup was afraid he'd offended him. But then Jack's lips parted, as if he just had an epiphany. His brows furrowed into a determined expression. "Believe," he said. Hiccup was confused. "In yourself?" Jack's laugh surprised him. It came out of nowhere, like Hiccup had just told a clever joke. "Yeah," he said, grinning. "That's exactly what I'll do." Hiccup supposed it was a nice sentiment, and probably useful to some degree, but it wouldn't solve all of Jack's problems. Still, Jack's mood seemed elevated, and Hiccup didn't have the heart to point out the holes in his plan. And even then, as odd as Jack's epiphany had been, something in his expression had struck Hiccup. Long after he had left the forge to continue preparing for the next dragon race, the conviction in Jack's voice rang in the back of Hiccup's mind, as if something as simple as belief was the solution to all of this.